Alice Zheng is a medically trained venture capitalist. She completed medical school and a year of residency, and in the process discovered a passion for business, which led her to pursue her MBA at Harvard Business School, work as a consultant at McKinsey, and pivot into venture capital. Her career blends her medical and business interests as she invests in early-stage women's health startups. Our talk explores why Alice made that pivot from medicine into business and how she navigated it, demonstrating that we can set ambitious goals and pursue our dreams while also remaining open to discovery in our career. Thanks for joining me. Hope you enjoy it. I read through your LinkedIn profile and some of the articles that are written about you, and I found your path very fascinating. But I know that sometimes titles and dates don't tell the full story. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your path in your own words.
Sure, yeah. I've made some pivots and taken different roads to get to where I am today. What I will say is that I think of myself as an eternal student. So some people look at my degrees and say, how on earth, or why do you have so many degrees? Well, really, it's out of just a passion for learning and perhaps some indecision about, where exactly I want to contribute and where is my place in the world. The other common thread is around my ultimate goal is to make an impact for those who are the most underserved. And throughout my career and learning journey, I found that there are different ways to do that. So it's really a matter of figuring out what's the best lever, what's the best platform and function for me to have that kind of impact. And so just to start from the beginning, so my family immigrated from China when I was young, and I grew up in Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan for undergrad, and like many other children of immigrants, I was pre-med. My mom had wanted to be a doctor in China, but she wasn't able to due to various reasons, including the Cultural Revolution, which had shut down a lot of universities. So I grew up really with that interest in health for sure, but very much pursued a pre-med path. And while I was exploring different topics I was interested in, I became interested in global public health. And so I did end up getting an MPH. I was taking a lot of classes in the public health school as an undergrad to the point where I thought I should, maybe have a second major here, or I'm spending so much time here, but they wouldn't do another a bachelor degree second major, and so it ended up being an MPH. So it was really fun to get that kind of exposure. I spent my summer internship working in Uganda on women's health with women who were the most disadvantaged. These women had suffered childbirth injuries that were pretty terrible and were very stigmatized, within their societies. So as a pre-med, I was doing work in global public health. And at some point, while I was working more fully after college and the MPH, I moved to China and worked more full time in global public health. I had this realization that there's a lot you can do with an impact orientation through a nonprofit. It can sometimes be limited in terms of the scale and sustainability because you're always, seeking nonprofit, non-dilutive funding, grant funding to carry out your activities. And I became interested in the business world. And before that point, I was very skeptical of the business world. I thought that, corporations were very profit minded and not necessarily thinking about the best for, communities and societies. But became interested because I was just really exploring and trying to learn. So ultimately, when I started medical school a few years later, I found myself spending time at the business school a lot. Med student by day, went to the business school for classes and clubs and case competitions at night. Um, and that became a growing interest to the point where I thought I actually, would love to learn more about this. Came in very skeptically, but realized there's a lot to learn from the private sector. And at that point, there wasn't much overlap. People were really in one track or the other. These days, there's a lot of MD, MBAs and a lot of people straddling healthcare and business and all sorts of things. But at that time, it was pretty rare. And I was really there, to learn and was curious that I actually became really interested in the business side. And I ended up applying for an MBA and I went to a different school since I had been spending a lot of time in the same university. This is all University of Michigan. I ended up going to Harvard for business school, and that actually changed a lot of things in my trajectory. Before that point, I was planning to still be a doctor full time. While I was doing my MBA applications, I was continuing on with specialized rotations in women's health, OBGYN. I was getting rec letters ready to apply for residency. And even when I was in business school, I thought, well, this is fun. I'll do a summer internship in something really different, but plan to apply to residency. And that summer, I spent with McKinsey and management consulting, which really is jumping on the bandwagon as with every other MBA. But to me, it was very different because I had come from a global health world, social impact world, and this was classic, pure private sector business. So very new for me. And I had a really great summer working with a number of other physicians who all had left medicine to join McKinsey, but some of them still practice. So I got a little bit of a taste of like, what does a split career look like? And after I graduated, I was so torn that I still applied to residency. I couldn't decide. I had planned my whole life to be a doctor up until that point, and just felt like too much to walk away from, because I love patient care. Most people leave medicine because they don't want to see patients, but I actually do. I enjoyed it. So I was so undecided that I ended up applying to residency while I accepted the offer, and just took a long time to decide. And that part of that process was talking to lots of folks who had moved in one direction or the other, or both, and flip flop multiple times, and ultimately realized that there's no right answer in this situation. For some people, doing more clinical training because they love it makes more sense, and for others it doesn't make sense, and it makes sense to jump into another career if you're thinking about that anyway. So I ended up doing 1 year of residency, which I felt like was a nice in between. I could get some experience as a clinician before really moving more deeply into the business side. I ended up spending 5 years at McKinsey, learned a ton. I served clients from all over the healthcare value chain, from health systems to pharma companies to global health organizations. Even the thread throughout all of my career has been in women's health, and that carries through today as well. There came a point in time in which I then questioned whether McKinsey was the right place for me for a variety of reasons, and was really excited to join the venture fund I'm at now, called RH Capital, about 3 years ago, where I'm really able to do the work that I love, wear all the different hats that I mentioned: the public health, the clinical, the consulting hat. I also have a patient hat as well. I've experienced many conditions, and I'm investing now in with companies that are trying to solve them. So yeah, so it's been a really fun journey. Definitely not a linear path to VC, and not a typical path, but yeah, happy to dive in anywhere.
That's a fascinating path. I actually spoke to some of my friends who are currently, some of them are in med school, others are in residency. And I shared that I'm going to be speaking with you, and they were really excited to hear. And I asked them if they have any questions. So I think that having you reflect on some of the stuff that they're curious about
Sure.
could be really cool. You described something very interesting where when you were in med school, you were taking classes at the business school, you were involved in some clubs. So you're really immersing yourself in the business side of things while still a medical student. And one question I had from some of my friends is they asked, what is a good way to build connections and experience during medical school or residency to open the doors for a transition into the business and finance side of healthcare, if that's something that they end up being interested in?
Yeah, and as I said, these days it is much more common than it was before. In the past, Stanford was really the only school that had, students go the non-clinical route, and they were proud of it. They're close to Silicon Valley, it's unsurprising, but for some other schools, they didn't even publish students' names who didn't match into a residency, right? Because it was just so unusual. I do think that these days it is a little bit more typical. That said, I would not go to medical school unless you really want to be a doctor, because it is all consuming, like, just time wise, emotionally, physically. And so for someone who's thinking about going to medical school, maybe you're not there yet and you're like, should I do it? Should I not? I wouldn't do it unless you really want to be a doctor forever. That said, people do start sometimes, or they go into residency, or they become full-fledged attendings for 10, 15, 20 years, and then they want to switch. And of course that happens. But definitely, when you're going into it, it's not worth it unless you really want to stay. That said, there's lots of career flexibility these days. Like, you can be half clinical and half research. You could be half clinical and half doing something else, like entrepreneurship or hospital leadership. There's so many different avenues. So with that in mind, like, what are ways you can have a clinically grounded career but also dabble elsewhere? I would say, well, if you're in medical school, you're in a school of some sort, and likely there's other schools nearby. So there's a medical school, there's probably an engineering school, maybe a business school. So that's the most natural extension, is to get to know some folks, on the business side there. And a lot of times there's really great cross collaboration between medical school, engineering, and business, because if you're going to innovate, you need people who understand the clinical side, innovate in healthcare. I mean, you need engineers to design the products. And so there often are really interesting classes or extracurriculars that bring together folks from those different backgrounds. And absent of that, for me, like, I was able to audit classes at the business school. So that might be an option to audit and or join a class, or just like make some friends over there. And there's lots of different activities you can get involved with. The other idea would be, for medical students, you often have a summer where some folks are doing kind of bench research. And that's a summer where you could also look to spend time on the business side, maybe with a startup or maybe with hospital administration. Of course, if you are applying to a certain residency that expects you to have, very robust research experience and maybe you need to use it the summer for that, but there's chunks of time you can use. I've also heard of more and more medical schools consolidating the learning into like 3 years, for example, then having a fourth year. Really, you can like spend it as an elective year, like whether you're doing, bench research or you want to do something on the business side or administrative side, like that's an option as well. There's also a student group. It's called MD Plus. It's like a group of medical students in venture, for example. So that did not exist at all when I was in school. And like I didn't really know anyone who went into venture. Like I knew a few people who went to consulting, but definitely not VC. But now it's more and more popular. I think there's even like some of these med students are like fellows with certain venture capital funds. It's really exciting. In terms of when you're a resident, that may be a little bit tougher from just a time standpoint. You really just don't have a whole lot of time. And, some of the same things probably still apply. A lot of residency programs that are, based in academic centers, you can certainly get involved through the schools at those centers. If you are in a residency program that's kind of separate from that, you might need to just do a little bit more networking. Like who is in your field of training, who's dabbled in that way, whether it's entrepreneurship or consulting for a pharma company, or there's different ways to get involved. And I feel like the good first step is always talking to other folks who are doing what you want to be doing in the future.
Awesome. And for whoever's interested, I'll put in the description the healthcare VC group that you kind of mentioned.
mdplus.community.
Perfect. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm also curious whether healthcare VCs have a pipeline looking out for physicians to recruit, or if it's more necessary to just be proactive as the person looking for an opportunity. So just, I guess, abstracting this question, one aspect of being a candidate is just being proactive, selling your story and finding the right connections. But I am curious also if these types of healthcare VCs or, companies like McKinsey have opportunities where they're just structurally looking for these types of candidates.
I'll answer your question separately since it's really different between consulting and VC. So, just starting with consulting, all the large consulting firms absolutely have a pathway and a pipeline for physicians. And this includes both medical students as well as residents, as well as attendings. And depending on your seniority, you just slot in at different places. So, if you're a med student, you probably slot in as an associate. McKinsey had a program at some point, which was MD Fellow. It might still exist, where you can actually, rotate in for the summer or the year while you're a medical student. And if you're coming post med school or post residency, then you probably slot in as an associate. And if you're attending for a very long time, you're a little bit mid to late career, then there's different paths. But consulting absolutely keeps an eye out for MDs, and there's lots of intentionality around that. VC as a field is just not as organized or as structured in its recruiting approach. So while consulting firms are huge, they have huge entering classes every year. It's like the recruiting is a whole machine. Most VC funds are very small. Even the giant funds that have been around for decades and, have billions and billions of dollars under management, their teams are really small. And so they don't really have the same kind of cohort or classes the way that consulting firms or banks do. In a firm like mine, we're at the opposite of the spectrum. We're a very small, specialized fund. We have 3 full-time people. So for most VCs, there isn't a well-groomed funnel and certainly not profiles that are feeders into VC. Is I would say at the junior levels, perhaps investment banking, private equity are, popular backgrounds to have. But beyond that, it's people come into VC from all sorts of places. Like some are operators, as in they've been at a large company for a long time that's in the space that the firm is investing in. So they bring that industry know-how. Others are exited founders themselves. So that's how they get into it. There's just a lot of different paths and ways. So physicians are certainly very welcome. And I would say people with a technical background, whether it's MD or PhD, are very popular, especially at funds that are investing in technical areas like biotech funds. But there isn't quite the same, channel, I would say, as there is like for consulting, where it's just large entering classes and just it's a recruiting machine.
I think that is relevant to my podcast in general, and that I think is kind of applicable here, is that sometimes there's this trade-off between having a established plan in your career, kind of understanding where you're going in a few years and how one decision is probably going to lead to like future opportunities, versus remaining open to iteration and discovery. Sometimes it feels like maybe, being iterative might come at the expense of efficiently navigating your career. But on the other hand, having a plan and sticking to it no matter what could also come at a cost. So I'm curious for you in your career, how you manage the tension between, on one hand, making progress in your career and moving in a forward direction in a way that's aligned with what you're interested in. But on the other hand, remaining open to change, and when there's an opportunity, being brave enough to take that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely there's a tension, there's trade-offs, and I think it's also personality dependent. Like some people just have a plan and they just definitely stick to it. They don't want to take any risks. And that's what gives them the most peace, and it would be very anxiety provoking to do something different. And there are others where just by personality, like they just really like your latter approach of being more iterative and, having more just discovery oriented. I would say that for me, I feel like at each juncture I had a plan, but then at some point the plan wasn't no longer what I wanted. And so there was a pivot, and each pivot felt like a big deal. But we all live very long lives. And at the end of the day, what's really important is your personal life, and your family is the most important. So your career needs to fit into your life. And those needs actually change over time. Like the way work life balance works when you're in your early 20s without any obligations is really different from when I left McKinsey. I was a new mother in my like mid to late 30s. Like I just had different needs and different aspirations. So, personal life always comes first, and career needs to match that. And then the other is your interests might also change. I started out very much interested in the nonprofit world because I want to make an impact there. And the North Star has remained around impact and underserved groups, but the lever has changed. At some point I discovered, oh, maybe it's not actually through nonprofits that I want to make this impact. Maybe it's through the private sector. Like it's not all profiteering. I want to actually be at the intersection. So it's like as you learn and grow as a person, the content of what you want to be doing might change along with your personal needs that are changing. It can be nice to have a plan so you feel like you're progressing in your plan, but then you always want to constantly reevaluate, like, is this specific career path or the specific job working for you on all those fronts? Is it giving you meaning? Is it fitting into the rest of your life and what your needs are? And again, those things are always changing. I don't think anyone like writes a plan for their 30-year career and like follows it, right? Like there's always going to be pivots and changes. And it's sort of about at different points in your life, like what do you need in the holistic sense and how will you achieve it? And also, each job that you take is really a chapter in the book. And I worked with a career coach a few years ago, and one of the tenets was, envision where you want to be in 10, 20 years. Like, what does that end game look like? And that, that what you say now might change, maybe different from what you say 5 years ago and 5 years in the future. But, let's say that's today's vision for the end game. Each job doesn't need to be that end game. It's actually going to be a chapter in the book to get there. And then during each chapter, for some of them, it's more important to focus on the career element and is it giving you exactly what you want from a career standpoint. And other times, maybe you're balancing something different. So just this idea, and maybe this goes along with the iterative idea, is like you're not going to solve for everything at once in a single role. Also, your plan might change for very good reasons, or what you desire might change, and to be open and flexible to that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating to hear how you approach this and just your perspective in general. And along the lines of iteration and, what we perceive that we want in the present versus where we end up, I'm curious if I came up to you freshman year of college and told you that you'd end up working in consulting and venture capital, how do you think you'd have reacted?
I would have never believed you because I don't think I even knew what consulting. I didn't know what McKinsey was. I didn't know what consulting was. I certainly had no idea what VC was at that time. Nothing finance oriented. I mean, I was like a bleeding heart, like, humanitarian, which I still am. Like in many ways, just not as my day job. But at that time, I wanted to follow the footsteps of Paul Farmer, which many of your medical friends, probably have heard of. I grew up in the generation of med students that all wanted to be Paul Farmer and, work in global health and save lots of lives and do lots of amazing things for the poorest of the poor. And I never would have envisioned being in the private sector where when I was at McKinsey, I was serving pharma companies, flying around the country, sitting in boardrooms, doing these, private sector things. I never would have envisioned that. And the fund that I'm at now, we're actually very impact oriented. So it actually, for me, it does, everything does tie together. We're an impact oriented fund investing in an underserved area of women's health. So it all ties, but it's still part of finance. And finance was never something I would have ever pursued. I majored in biochemistry. I, had a double major or the MPH in health behaviors and health education. I spent all my free time in global health. Like I really had no exposure to the private sector. I had no idea. If I were to have interviewed at that point, I would have failed miserably because I would have known where to start.
When you actually made that pivot, it wasn't a single moment pivot. You had a few steps in that direction. But generally speaking, during the time when you pivoted from medicine to business, even though your focus was still on healthcare, how did you feel when you first decided to change course?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big decision. I will actually say, like, the first moment I thought about it was during my medical school summer. Most people were spending time in the lab. I actually Didn't do that. I went off to India and I spent time with a maternity hospital that was cross subsidizing care such that they had these really nice, fancy private rooms for women who could afford it. And then that allowed them to subsidize care for women who couldn't. So that it was interesting because I was able to make it kind of count, from the clinical angle since it was in clinical medicine, but then also, was business exposure as well. And I think that was the first moment where I was there. I was working on a variety of topics, and I realized that I don't want to be the specialized clinician in the room in those organizations. They certainly have chief medical officers, they certainly have medical directors that do the clinical piece of it. I actually want to run the whole thing. I want to be able to speak the language of the business folks and potentially lead an organization like that, do the strategy. And so the clinical part was really helpful, but I realized that I was missing a whole vocabulary and way of thinking. And so that was the first moment where I thought, before that, I was interested in exposure, but thought of myself as a doctor. But then in that moment, I really became more seriously interested in I don't actually want to be the doctor of the room. I want to be a leader in a more holistic sense. And that's what prompted me to apply to the MBA. And then, everything else happened from there. In terms of how did I feel while pivoting? So at this point would have been I finished the internship in consulting. I accepted the offer even, but said I was going to defer. I continued to apply to residency. I even interviewed for residency. It definitely weighed on me. It was a hard decision because I had spent 10 years prior to that preparing for that moment. In high school, I'm thinking about biology pre-med. In college, I'm pre-med. I eventually went to medical school. I did all the things and had my application for residency ready. I even interviewed. It just felt like I spent so much time and energy poured into this. How could you walk away from that, especially if I still enjoyed it? Again, for some people, they don't enjoy it anymore. No matter how much sunk cost there is, you walk away. But that wasn't true for me. So it really was, I saw a bigger potential somewhere else. And it was going from one exciting thing to another exciting thing, but it was hard to make that decision. And I talked to so many people for sure. I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, there's no right or wrong answer. No matter how much time you've put into something, if it's not the right path for you anymore, then it's just not the right path. And it doesn't actually make sense to stick it out if that's not where you ultimately want to land. And the other thing that I realized is that at that time, I felt like for me to make the biggest impact, in the world was at that unique intersection of business, public health, and medicine. At that time, it was very rare. Now it's less rare, but at the time I thought there's someone else who can treat a pneumonia better than I can. Lots of people who can deliver babies more effectively than I can, but there weren't that many people with that cross-sectional expertise. And so that felt to me like that was my calling. But it definitely weighed on me a lot. And I spent a lot of time deliberating, deciding if it was the right thing to do.
You have that unique intersection, and you also previously mentioned that you're an eternal student. I know that when you came into the business side of things, you had kind of been fresh off of a residency and experience clinically and being hands-on with patients. But I assume that as years go by, that side might be a little bit more in the distant past, and now you have more recent experience on the business side. How do you stay an eternal student and make sure that you don't forget the important clinical facets of what you're doing when you're going more and more into the
Mhm.
financial and business side of
Yeah.
things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a steep learning curve, for going from clinical to the business world. And even though I had an MBA, without disrespect to MBA programs, you're learning, but you don't really know how to do anything in reality. So I treated McKinsey as a residency for business, teach me everything I need to know. I learned some in the classroom, but now let's actually learn it practically. So McKinsey was actually a really great training ground for the business side of, reading financial statements, modeling. There's so many transferable skills. And now, yes, I'm on this side. I mean, there was another pivot, right, from consulting to venture. That's a whole different world. There are lots of translatable skills, but also new language, new capabilities, lots of new things to learn there. I think that transition probably felt a little more natural just because other consultants go into venture, I could learn from them versus at the time, there really just weren't many physicians leaving medicine. Now, where does clinical expertise versus what I'm doing now, how does that compare? Well, I will say, my day job is as an investor. So I'm doing all those investing things, and the clinical piece of my experience, it really is more of a background where like I'm not clinically active. I don't have a license. I'm not going to be up to date on actual clinical knowledge. And it's I know enough to have an impression, not enough to do anything really with it, but I know enough to have a hunch on some things. I can understand and read clinical papers and have a little bit more intuition there, but I'm not going to pretend like I'm actually a doctor because I'm not. So the reality is I am far away from that, but I carry it with me as experience around like what is it like to be working with patients very intimately. It's a real privilege to treat someone as their physician. And that's something that I will always keep with me. So that experience, having seen the health system from the inside, like you really can't replicate that anywhere else. You can't really explain it to anyone. You just have to like have seen it yourself. I carry that with me, but I'm not necessarily like using clinical knowledge day to day.
It's just really fascinating for me to hear how all those pieces come together. So I know that we have like maybe 7 more minutes, and I have 2 or 3 more questions. So we'll just see how it goes. Worst case, we'll come to a stop. You mentioned that when you were deliberating, or when you were kind of initializing the pivot more officially into business, you had a ton of conversations, and I don't know if a ton, but you had some conversations with people, and you were just, you had some dilemmas. Do you remember any conversation in particular that was meaningful and that really helped you decide to just go for it?
Yeah, I mean, I had definitely a lot of conversations. People who left medicine for the business world, people who did the opposite, people who went back and forth multiple times even. And what I was listening for was really, why did you do it? And, how did you feel about it? And just seeing what resonated. And then I realized that the values that I cared about, the things that made me excited, did align more with the business side. And my biggest takeaway was really, again, that there's no right or wrong answer to that. There's actually a couple other reasons why I went for it, other than talking to other people. One is that in my first year of the MBA program, we had this exercise. We read reflections from alumni who are 10 years out from graduation and how were their lives, work, personal, all of that. And then we wrote our own. So we were tasked with pretend like you're 10 years out. What's happening in your life? And I wrote one version where I did all of residency and then I pivoted to consulting. Then I was like, oh my gosh, 10 years have passed. And like, I've barely started doing what I actually want to do. And then I wrote another version where I don't go to residency and I go to straight to consulting for 4 or 5 years and I go do something else really interesting. And then I realized that like time is passing. And, in your 20s, it feels like you have a lot of time. And indeed, I took off 2 years before medical school to work in global health. I took off 2 years during medical school to, get the MBA. And I'm like, well, I don't have infinite time anymore, actually, like I did earlier in my life. By then, I'm late 20s and I do want to have a family. So does it really make sense to do 4 or 5 years of clinical training if I'm already pretty certain that I'm not going to stay a clinician forever? If I have aspirations to probably leave pretty quickly, then maybe it's not actually worth all that effort. And plus, like, I don't want to take up a spot for someone who actually will stay in medicine and actually treat patients. And so thinking about it, from talking to other people told me that there's no right or wrong. So then I thought about it from my own personal perspective and I realized I don't want to be a trainee forever. Being a resident is training, in my perspective, going to McKinsey. That's in the early days, it's training. So at some point, I want to like do the thing I actually want to do. So when I add up all the years, I realized that it didn't actually make sense. Now, one question that people ask is like, what will you regret more? Will you regret never seeing a patient again, or never doing another C-section, or never doing another cervical exam, etc.? And then I realized I'm like, I think I'm actually okay with that. So that's a good question to ask, right? Because once you do leave for a number of years, it's really hard to go back. So yeah, are you going to regret never touching a patient again? I said, I'm actually okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's for people who have this particular dilemma about their path in medicine, or just people in general, even myself, just looking into the future, I think this exercise that you described is really powerful. So I'll consider doing it. And I think maybe people who are in the same position or a similar position should maybe consider that as well.
Yeah.
So
And
I
I
appreciate
think
you.
other jobs just have much more mobility. Just medicine is the one where if you leave, you can go back, but it's pretty hard. But most other roles, like whether you're a PM or entrepreneur, you could probably go back and forth. So it's much less stark.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's early for someone who's not in medicine. But yeah, I appreciate that. And since we have like a few minutes left, there were 2 questions. I'll try to like kind of merge them together. I was going to ask if you have any advice for people who still feel like they haven't figured out where they want to go, but still want to make progress and spend time in a way that they find meaningful. And the second question, whether there's anything on the topic of life changes that we haven't covered that you'd like to leave our audience with.
Advice, if you haven't figured out what you want, but you want to do things that are meaningful, well, I feel like the answer is actually right in the question itself, which is it's okay to not know what your end game is. Your needs and your wants might change, but definitely doing something in the moment that you do derive meaning out of. Like, so sometimes I talk to people who are like, okay, so I want to be in venture. So does that mean that I should go into private equity for a few years or do that for a few years and then try? And I said, there's like no guarantees how anything lands in the future. I only do a next career step if you actually want to be doing that in the moment as well, right? It's not just the, what's the phrase? It's not just the destination, it's the journey itself too. Like the journey has to make sense to you and be meaningful. So as long as you're doing something today that you find meaningful and that you think gets you closer to where you want to go, then that's great. And yeah, maybe the more reflections on what is that 10-year vision? Not that that's what you're going to stick to dogmatically, but just to help you envision where you want to go. So then the next chapter is moving you towards that. And then in terms of life changes, I would say life does happen. You know, there's times in your life where it's all about your school or your career, especially like college, you know, post college time period. You can push with full force. You know, life happens, you know, after that. And for some, life happens even earlier. And by life, I mean things that will take your attention and time away that are really critical and important, whether it's like, could be health issues, you know, with yourself or your family, or you have your own family, and that just in and of itself takes up a lot of time. So just recognizing that your needs might change and that's okay. And what success looks like may also change, and that changed a lot for me when I became a parent. And there's a long road ahead in life too, so if something doesn't go your way in this specific role in this immediate moment, that's okay. We have a long career, people take lots of different paths, and you will find a narrative to weave it all together.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really great to hear from you, and I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to see where your road takes you down the line. But I'm also really grateful that you spent time chatting with me and just with the audience about your experiences and your reflections. So thank you so much. That was great.
Awesome.